A craftsman of musical instruments, the name George Frederic was chosen by the father in respect to Handel, the composer's day of birth being 23rd of February, the same day as the new baby's birth. Born in 1817 as the eldest son of a second marriage, the deaths of two younger brothers in 1823, and then the severe blow of his mother's death in 1826 when he was only 9, meant that death dominated George Frederic's early life and was to be an obsession for him ever after. George Frederic drew from an early age, reflecting a natural skill as a draftsman. Born and raised in London, Watts lived with his father and half-sisters at various addresses in the city. As the family's fortunes declined around 1826, they moved to Star Street, Paddington, then on the outskirts of London. Through professional connections with another family of piano makers, George Watts Sr. arranged for his son to enter the studio of sculptor William Behnes in Soho. In 1827, aged 10, George Frederic began informal attendance at the busy sculpture studio on Dean Street. With commissions for public monuments and portrait busts, the popular London character Behnes enjoyed success at this stage in his career. George Frederic learned by drawing from plaster casts, but most notably he encountered the world of antiques for the first time. As a sculptor, Behnes carved and worked with marble, facilitating George Frederic with access to plaster casts of the Elgin Marbles, which he soon discovered was only a short walk away at the British Museum. Newly installed from 1832, the Elgin Marbles became the cradle of Watts's entire artistic career. The Elgin Marbles were my teachers. It was from them alone that I learned. George Frederic admired Behnes' other talent as a portrait draftsman, and the youth began producing small portrait drawings in colored chalk and pencil as a way to earn a living. The master sculptor's younger brother introduced Watts to a wider literary horizon and arranged George Frederic's tutelage in oil painting. From past masters of portraiture available at the National Gallery, Watts's oil copies, smoked to appear old, started Watts towards more formal training as a painter. By the age of 16, George Frederic had his own studio on Upper Norton Street near Fitzroy Square and supported himself as a portrait draftsman, but his high aspirations sought out the highest exemplars of the past. He drew an approximate rendition of Paul preaching at Athens as a way to learn how to organize a large multi-figure composition. Watts's technique developed sufficiently for him to enter the Royal Academy Schools at Somerset House in spring 1835 at the age of 18. However, the routine of copying when he already had developed the skill on his own was stifling. His oils had also advanced to a degree of fluency, not only in technique but also as a study of character. Inspired by the great artists of the recent past such as Joshua Reynolds and living history painters such as William Hilton, George Frederic matured as an artist during the 1830s. The ideal of history painting was still very much alive, and he inherited a belief in high art, as epitomized in the work of the old masters. On 28th of April 1837, a sunny day set the stage for a landmark event in the London art world. Crowds surged Trafalgar Square. A military band blasted in the early afternoon as King William IV arrived to open the new home of the Royal Academy of Arts. The monarch then set off on a private tour of the 69th exhibition of the Royal Academy prior to the public opening. Royal portraits, such as David Wilkie's portrait of His Majesty King William IV and Martin Archer Shee's portrait of the Queen, took pride of place in the gallery. Here the royal entourage also admired William Eddy's massive scene from classical mythology, The Sirens and Ulysses. On display in 1837 were Edwin Landseer's The Old Shepherd's Chief Mourner, among others by this popular artist, along with J.M.W. Turner's The Parting of Hero and Leander and The Story of Apollo and Daphne. Also, the posthumously exhibited Arundel Mill and Castle by long-standing Academy member John Constable. As King William passed through the middle room, they might have glimpsed a wounded heron by a first-time exhibitor named George Frederic Watts. Some years earlier, President of the Royal Academy Shee had told Watts Sr., "I can see no reason why your son should take up the profession of art. words that became a stimulus for the young artist. Now aged 20, Watts received his first official recognition that day in April 1837. Portraiture occupied George Frederic's energies and enabled him to acquire a new studio on Clipstone Street north of Oxford Street. Producing modestly sized oil portraits precise in their execution, Watts gained some aristocratic patrons, but mostly commissions were from London's middle class. A turning point for Watts's fortunes is wrapped with an interesting anecdote. Greek shipping merchant Constantine Ionides commissioned a portrait from artist Samuel Lane. Once completed, Ionides' son desired a copy of this portrait and through an acquaintance offered Watts the sum of £10 for the job. The copy was made by Watts, and it was Watts's copy that was preferred over the original. The Ionides immediately commissioned further works, including a grand family portrait, marking the beginning of a relationship that lasted for more than half a century. Now, with sable patronage, George Frederic attempted subject paintings in oils, first modestly sized works from classical mythology, Shakespeare, and Romantic literature. Blondel depicts the 12th century troubadour singing outside the prison where Richard the Lionheart is held. This scene from the medieval past was probably a study for the larger work sent to the British institution in 1843. With the aim of promoting historical painting, in April 1842, the Fine Arts Commission announced a competition to decorate the new Palace of Westminster. Artists were to submit life-size figures illustrating scenes from British history. The large compositions required many studies. One surviving head study shows a model gazing upwards, an extension of Watts's portrait work and a way of humanizing the scenes. The overall composition of British hero Caractacus displays a skillful Raphael-esque arrangement, with the many figures divided into groupings that fluently guide the eye, and crowned by the outlaw hero as paradoxically both stately and humble. The exhibition opened in summer 1843 in Westminster Hall, and out of 140 entries, the government's most affluent judged and awarded Watts one of the 3 top prizes of £300. Less than a month after winning the cash prize, George Frederic embarked on a journey that dramatically changed his life. In 1843, aged 26, Watts set off for Europe. After 6 weeks in Paris, staying in the Latin Quarter with fellow artist Edward&Ezra, he traveled on to Chalon-sur-Saône, down the Rhône to Marseille, then to Italy via Livorno. He ended his journey in Florence in the early autumn of 1843, where he intended to study fresco painting. Urged to visit the English minister Baron Holland and his wife, Watts arrived at their palatial townhouse. As his host later noted, he came for a few days and stayed several years. During this period, he visited the art collections in museums and churches in Florence. Removed from the practical concerns of his life in London, George Frederic reinvented himself as part of a great tradition of master painters. During a dress party in early 1845, Watts donned a suit of armor discarded by another guest, and then painted himself in the spirit of his Renaissance predecessors. More than just a romanticized self-image, for the first time in his life, Watts fully devoted himself to his art and spent much of his time painting and drawing a circle of eccentric friends, including members of the Italian nobility. He became a sensitive portrait artist, studying faces to gain an understanding of character and personality. As a way of thanking his host, he drew some 40 portraits of the Hollands friends, a unique series that remains together. Watts studied fresco techniques and painted one full-scale fresco during the 4-year stay. Enthused for painting large, ambitious works, Watts returned to London in June 1847 to submit for the Houses of Parliament decorative exhibition at Westminster Hall. Winning another first-class prize of £500 confirmed Watts' status as a history painter. Shortly afterwards, the government purchased Watts's patriotic submission of England's first naval victory, Alfred inciting the Saxons to prevent the landing of the Danes by encountering them at sea. The purchase price was a healthy £200, yet he received no actual commissions to paint murals in the new Palace of Westminster. After an absence of 4 years, Watts had lost ground in English circles, yet expectations were still high, and some in the art world expected him to take the lead as the history painter of his generation. Yet these expectations were in lieu of Benjamin Haydon's tragic suicide a year before in June 1846. The genre of grand historical painting was fast becoming out of favor and seen as old-fashioned. Using a makeshift studio provided by a friend at Dorchester House, Watts produced some unusual large paintings, including the bold and visionary work, Satan, and also one of his most philosophically obscure subjects, Time and Oblivion. In Time and Oblivion, two figures represent universal types don classical garb. The side identifies time, but the other figure extends a drape, seemingly to cover and enwrap the viewer by special appointment. Realizing it was outside contemporary taste, George Frederic did not send the 6.5 foot tall by 10.5 foot wide canvas to an exhibition at this time. Yet the newly acquired friend, John Ruskin, admired and borrowed the painting, calling Watts the only real painter of history or thought we have in England. Watts replied to Ruskin, "My own views are too visionary and the qualities I aim at are too abstract to be attained, or perhaps to produce any effect if attained." Producing a series of social realist canvases depicting the problems of mid-century Victorian society, the works reflected the somberness of his own state of mind. George Frederic could not find patrons for the history paintings he had planned, and personally he was moody, depressed, and in poor health. Found drowned, the Irish famine, under a dew arch, and The Seamstress. The modern life subjects did not go to public exhibitions, but they had an impact to his own circle of friends in the new studio on Charles Street in Mayfair. A needed boost in Watts's career occurred from the Royal Academy of 1850 when he exhibited an over-life-size painting, The Good Samaritan. In the catalogue he commented that it was painted as an expression of the artist's admiration and respect for the noble philanthropy of Thomas Wright of Manchester, citing further an article on Wright's work to help reform prisoners and turn felons into citizens. This work stemmed from the thought of his social realist paintings made palatable for its audience with the biblical tale. But the bold figures based on sculpture made no concessions to popular taste. Furthermore, when the Academy hung the painting poorly, Watts was insulted. For the next 8 years, he stopped sending in his major paintings to the Royal Academy and submitted nothing at all between 1853 and 1857. It was only 13 years on from his debut in 1837, but Watts now realized he would have to move on without the institutional support of the Academy. Mirroring his experiences in Italy, Watts moved into the bohemian artistic salon Little Holland House just outside of London. Living with the Prinsep family during this decade, who had leased the house from Lord Baron, he had the security of a home and a studio, as well as a warm atmosphere. A whole social world came to gatherings, including musicians, socialites, writers like Tennyson, and the young Pre-Raphaelites. Watts acquired a reputation as an artist forging the path within the extended circles of Little Holland House. Designed in the mid-1850s, Justice, a hemicycle of lawgivers, was a commissioned mural for Lincoln's Inn. George Frederic casted his friends to model characters from history, and the impressive work no doubt boosted his reputation. In November 1852, Watts finally received a commission to paint a fresco in the new Palace of Westminster. Poets' Hall, more formally known as the Upper Waiting Hall of the House of Lords, depicted scenes from the works of native poets in panels over 10 feet high. Watts painted the Triumph of the Red Cross Knight based from Edmund Spenser's poem, The Faerie Queen. So down he fell, that the earth him underneath did groan, as feeble so great load to lift. So down he fell, and like an heaped mountain lay. The heroic knight stands triumphant, placing his foot on the dead dragon with his mouth gaping. At the seat of government, this work put Watts firmly in the public sphere. Large-scale portrait drawings, carefully drafted, were the only works Watts sent to the Royal Academy for a few years after 1850. Patronage for Watts's portraiture in this decade grew out of his connection with the powerful and well-connected. Prompted by the establishment of the National Portrait Gallery, which opened in 1856, George Frederic embraced portraiture with new enthusiasm. To produce pictures that shall be valuable in all times both as faithful records and as works of art, Watts declared his intentions. Traditionally, it did not occupy the same elevated station as history painting, but it now had a higher profile in society. Although he showed his ambivalent, perhaps sensitive, attitude to the institution by using a pseudonym, Watts re-entered the Royal Academy in the late 1850s. His portrayals of the poet Alfred Lord Tennyson, who became a close friend, began in 1857 and forged new paths in portraiture. A biographer writes, Watts became the painter of poets and by extension a poet in paint. His portrait of Tennyson shows a starkly frontal view opening out to a mysterious seashore setting. Watts decided to form his own portrait collection of eminent individuals. Widely known in the public and referred to in the press, this long-standing project set George Frederic apart as an artist of high ideals. Inspired with the notion of modern beauty, he produced a series of poetic images of young women. In seeking out models, Watts met the actress Kate Terry and her younger sister Ellen, an event that had a major impact on George Frederic's personal life. An image of poetic beauty that went beyond the boundaries of portraiture, the two models were the subject of the painting, The Sisters. Although Kate was the theatrical star of the moment, Watts focused on Ellen. Speaking of his attraction towards her, to remove an impulsive girl from the dangers and temptations of the stage. Watts married her in 1864. She was 17 and he was about to turn 47. They separated within a year. But during their time together, she inspired beautiful paintings, including Choosing and Ophelia. In 1865, Julia Margaret Cameron made a portrait photograph of the artist entitled The Whisper of the Muse, which reviews the persona of Watts as a poet-artist. Cameron knew George Frederic well and took this photograph of him while he visited Tennyson on the Isle of Wight. Music and poetry combined in an image that shows Watts removed from the worries of mastering a medium, but appears as one who is simply open to inspiration. Watts's melding of poet and painter attracted a younger generation of artists in the circle of Dante Gabriel Rossetti, who paid close attention to his ventures. Watts exhibited in venues other than the Royal Academy that had sprung up to serve for the new innovative artists. However, Frederick Leighton, who had been staunchly pro-Royal Academy from the time of his election as associate in 1864, still promoted George Frederic to the Academy. Such moves encouraged a revision in the rules so that Watts's name could be put forward by the members, not himself, for election. Elected Associate of the Royal Academy at the age of 50, the unique event in the Academy's history was a testament to the reputation in which George Frederic was held by fellow artists. Throughout the late 1860s and into the 1870s, Watts conceived new imaginative paintings that embodied universal concepts. In 1874, Watts explained love and death as follows. Love is not restraining death, for it could not do so. I wish to suggest the passionate though unavailing struggle to avert the inevitable. You know my great desire to use such talents as I may have and such experience in art as I have been able to acquire, with the object of proving that art, like poetry and music, may suggest the noblest and tenderest thoughts, inspiring and awakening, if only for a time, the highest sensibilities of our nature. The work had been sparked by a personal experience when Watts witnessed the illness of his friend William Kerr, 8th Marquis of Lothian, who, despite various doctors, died at a young age in 1870. He channeled the soul-rending confrontation into an allegory in which youthful love is unable to resist the majestic female figure of death. The actual design developed in several versions that increased in size, as was his practice with other compositions. These versions were often over life-size and required larger venues to be appreciated. George Frederic considered Love and Death, along with other symbolical works, to be poems painted on canvas. When the Grosvenor Gallery opened in May 1877, he found his ideal exhibition venue. Establishing this new exhibition gallery to showcase the work of artists who found the Royal Academy too populous and what Watts himself commented as no place for a grave, deliberate work of art, Grosvenor aided a revival of culture and love of beauty. So spoke the young poet Oscar Wilde. Commenting particularly about his appreciation for Love and Death, Wilde remarks Watts as a great originative and imaginative genius. The triumphant appearance of Love and Death revealed for the first time symbolical paintings to the elite of the art world. With his artistic ideals finally in fruition, George Frederic sent the gallery nearly 60 paintings over the next 10 years, including Time, Death, and Judgment, and Paolo and Francesca. Such work satisfied his ambition to paint ideas on a grand scale. Regarding Paolo and Francesca, F. G. Stevens wrote that these designs are full of poetry. As a precursor to the Symbolist movement, the paintings create a gloomy world of doomed souls. When the paintings were exhibited on the continent, French author Joris Karl Huysmans characterized Watts as a dreamy Englishman afflicted with a predilection for hideous hues. Such works, and those Watts exhibited in Paris in 1878 and 1880, had a key influence on symbolism in France. Paintings Hope and Mammon appeared at the Exposition Universelle in 1889, further cementing Watts to this Continental movement. Management of the legendary artist evolved after George Frederic's marriage to Mary Fraser Tytler in 1886. The social phenomenon of an artist as celebrity was not common in Victorian society, and during the 1880s there was a steady stream of media including articles about George Frederic's life and lifestyle. His celebrity provided Watts autonomy of the presentation of his work. He had recently moved into his newly built home, New Little Holland House, on Melbury Road in Kensington. He built a glass-roofed gallery onto his house dubbed the Little Holland House Gallery, which opened to the public on Saturday and Sunday afternoons. The substantially sized gallery formed a major feature in the Kensington area and promoted the sale of work competing with artists like Millais and Lawrence Alma Tadema to sell for top prices. With the encouragement of an American admirer, Watts sent 50 of his works to New York's newly opened Metropolitan Museum of Art. The exhibition was the first blockbuster display on record. In 1887, the Pall Mall Gazette produced a catalog of Watts's paintings confirming the status of his life's work up to the age of 70. Due in part to his association with the Society for Psychical Research, a new mystical way of thinking renewed his creativity, and Watts produced some of his most original compositions. A friend and writer commented on the mystic, indefinite feeling of poetic truth. Hope is the best-known work, but others include Dweller in the Innermost and The All-Pervading. Mesmeric dolls, like figures drawn by a medium in a state of a trance, wrote Arthur Symonds, an author nearly 50 years the junior of Watts. Haziness and amorphous mist composed George Frederic's imagery in the 1880s. To counteract the dark qualities in his paintings, Watts sought more pronounced effect of color and light at this time. One critic noted that the love of color reasserted itself. Watts experimented with mediums and was observed using oil paint as one would use pastel, using dry pigment in loose touches. This change was vividly expressed in a bust-length nude ultra, the Scandinavian spirit of the rainbow. Similar effects occur in Love and Life, where atmospheric effects create a swirl of light and color. In the oil study for Olympus on Ida, Watts placed the figure in a golden atmosphere surrounded by clouds and haze. Pleased with a certain opalescent quality, he left the oil study unfinished. The ethereal figures in a cloud-like setting embodies a visionary quality that became identified uniquely with George Frederic Watts. Watts sought sitters specifically to enhance his self-created collection of portraits. Figures from the arts, politics, and academe came to the studio. Always intended to be left to the nation, the collection as a whole was in progress for decades. In 1897, at the New Gallery on Regent Street, London, George Frederic's life work was presented in the year of his 80th birthday. His preface to the exhibition catalogue hoped the viewer to see a bald and bare idea of the thread of thought connecting the whole together. The exhibition fulfilled a project for the symbolic history of mankind in what Watts called the House of Life. Standing as one does at my age upon the brink of that dark abyss, deep, unmeasured, and unplumbed, the everyday becomes more and more attenuated in its interest. The artist's act of creation, a way of dealing with the closure of life by imagining its ultimate beginning, is displayed in this visionary work, The Sower of the Systems. But the last weeks of his life in 1904 were reserved for destiny. The dark cape casting a shadow on the face seems foreboding. Poised just above the shore, the waves at the sea's edge allude to the passage of time. But the fiery and vibrant colors rightfully clothe George Frederic's final painting with glory.